Thank you so much for watching the Michael Finkley Show on this special Tuesday night edition. May 25th, 2020 changed the perspective of our thinking and viewing. We witnessed video live as a police officer held an African American man down on the ground for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, where at the end he lost his life. Now the trial of Derek Chauvin is on. Today we bring in a expert, former lieutenant of the NYPD and also professor at Pace University, Dr. Darrin Porcher, as he tells us the ins and outs of this trial so far in day 7. Take a look. Welcome to the Michael Finkley Show. So all eyes have been on the trial of Derek Chauvin concerning the death of George Floyd. Tonight we chat with former NYPD lieutenant and also he's a professor at Pace University, Dr. Darrin Porcher. Thank you, Porcher, for being with us today.
Good evening. Thank you, Michael. And it's a pleasure to appear on your podcast. I'm looking forward to it. I think that we can have a robust discussion and touch on several issues from a social perspective and get a perspective out to the viewership that they can embrace.
Definitely, definitely. So let's just get right to it. I've been reading from my notes, be taking notes from the trial, day 7, and it's just been amazing just to see the different witnesses and the person just speaking their truth within this. And so I guess the first question is, we see that the prosecutor is viewing Floyd as the victim, and then the defense is looking at the story of his life as in the negative perspective. So we also see the prosecutor looking at the video as well. So how much does that video weigh within this trial?
Well, I think the video is significant because I think that's what caused people to embark upon a social justice campaign as we relate back to what happened in May of 2020 in connection with the death of George Floyd. The video, and I'll tell you, I just psychologically, I went into this from the perspective of former officer Derek Chauvin was actually absolutely guilty. There was really no need for a trial. I mean, granted, the Constitution provides us, I should say, the amendments in the Constitution afford us a speedy trial. So this is something that runs par for the course from the aspect of democracy. But then as I got deeper into this from a more cerebral perspective, I understood and I was able to identify that this is not as clear cut as people think. Right. The one thing that everyone thought was that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for the duration. And we've come to find that that wasn't the case. The knee was actually on the back of George Floyd's neck, back. I want to say his back and his shoulders. And so, right. So when you look at the autopsy, for example, you clearly see that there's no bruising to the neck. The bruising is actually to the shoulder blade, which really changes the dynamic and the level of how egregious we perceive former officer Derek Chauvin's actions, because we all saw these videos of our perception of a police officer, a white male police officer, with his knee on the neck of an African-American male as he lied helplessly in the street and he died. However, the dynamic has changed. We've looked at arguments from the prosecution and the defense up till this point, and there's been a series of experts that have introduced testimony as to what the provisions or the protocols of that department were. And we clearly saw that officers were allowed to employ a level of force in connection with something they refer to as a neck restraint. But it even went one step further. After today's testimony from the experts, it was we're not really so sure if this was a neck restraint. It appears as if this was a prone position restraint. When I say a prone position restraint, meaning Mr. Floyd was laid down in something we refer to as the prone position, which consists of a person being faced and chest down on the pavement. And this is problematic in law enforcement because whenever someone is in that prone position, it shouldn't be for an extended duration of time, because when a person is in that prone position, it inhibits the rise and fall of the chest, which makes it difficult, and a person can experience labored breathing. So you've heard Mr. Floyd speak to his inability to breathe throughout the encounter, and it's also alleged that he had taken something we refer to as a speedball, and it's a concoction of fentanyl and methamphetamine, and that can alter a person's mind. But you also have to take in consideration, had Derek Chauvin not encountered George Floyd on that day, would he have still lived? And so one would argue that the defense would argue that it was the illegal substance that was in George Floyd's body. But you need to have to gain a conviction based on the charges that we have: murder, first, second, and third degree. You need to prove that the officer, or I should say the defendant's actions, were a significant contributor to the death of the deceased, which was George Floyd. So had Derek Chauvin not interacted with George Floyd on that day, would he still have been alive? Right. And that's the million-dollar question that the prosecution is trying to prove and the defense is trying to counter. And today was a tremendous day for the defense, because the defense was able to introduce things that I was unaware of, in terms of the knee was not on the neck, it was in fact on the shoulder blade, which changes the dynamic from a psychological perspective, because the camera angle that I saw made it appear as if Derek Chauvin's knee was on George Floyd's neck.
Gotcha. So if it was either on his neck or his shoulder, is that correct protocol for police training?
Well, the training was it was sound from the perspective of the provisions in that police department's procedural guidelines. That that department being the Minneapolis Police Department, they did allow for a neck restraint. We had trainers come and speak to the an officer being allowed to apply a neck restraint. However, when it becomes problematic is when it becomes excessive. So it's okay for you to introduce that level of force, but once you stabilize the individual, that's when the level of force should recede, and you should use alternative means to stabilize that individual. In addition to that, we look at the need for medical aid. Derek Chauvin was trained in CPR, and the department provisions state that the officer must provide a level of medical aid to anyone under their care, custody, and control. So when we speak to the 9+ minutes when Derek Chauvin had George Floyd on the ground, and it was clearly perceived as George Floyd was unresponsive, that's when CPR should have been introduced into the equation. George Floyd's pulse was taken, and it was determined that he didn't have a pulse. One of the officers stated that to Derek Chauvin. However, Derek Chauvin stated EMS is on the way. That wasn't the appropriate provision. So going back to when you asked me, was this an authorized maneuver in connection with the pressure to one's neck or the shoulder? Yes, it was, but it's not continuous. The use of force is only to interdict a particular condition that you're engaged in or encountering. If you felt as if George Floyd was resisting, okay, it's justified in using it to stabilize him. But once George Floyd was stabilized, as we saw he was handcuffed, that's when the use of force should have eroded. And that is the question that we're looking at, as to why didn't he remove his knee from the shoulder or the back and provide a different sense of force or containment. That, as I mentioned earlier, that prone position is a very dangerous position for a person to be placed in for an extended period of time. George Floyd should have been placed on his side, which would have allowed him the ability to breathe unrestricted.
Gotcha. So is that the definition, the law definition of reasonable force?
Well, there's no quite definition. There's no clear-cut definition on reasonable force, because when we think about there's a Supreme Court decision Graham versus Connor, which states that a police officer can use a reasonable amount of force against an individual if they encounter an immediate threat to the officer or a third person. So the force needs to be reasonable and the threat needs to be immediate. Now, you have to look at what's reasonable through the eyes of the officer. The officer is going to have to articulate what he believed was reasonable. Now, it's not as if the officer can just say, look, I shot and killed somebody as I was walking down the street because I didn't like the way they looked and I perceived this as being reasonable. Reasonableness is something that falls within the best practices of policing. And that's going to be the challenge for Derek Chauvin. And I believe that he's going to have to take the stand. A lot of my colleagues are against this, but I think that the only way that he can make it through this trial is to humanize himself to the jury, because the jury only sees this video. They see these stark facial expressions, but they didn't have the ability to experience who Derek Chauvin is. And if Derek Chauvin takes the stand, he can speak to what he perceived as being reasonable and the threat that he was looking to interdict in connection with George Floyd on that day back in May of 2020.
Gotcha. And in your personal opinion, when it comes down to Derek Chauvin and his actions, you being a former lieutenant yourself, does his actions show that he was a bad officer?
Well, I was a lieutenant in the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, so on many cases, I investigated a use of force employed by a police officer or police misconduct for that matter. And from my perspective, I'm not looking at this from the lay perspective. I'm looking at this as a former practitioner. In
Correct.
addition to that, I work as an expert in use of force cases throughout the country. That being said, when I look at this case, I think that it's a troubling narrative that he, meaning Derek Chauvin, is going to have to produce a rationale as to why he did what he did. Now, we have multiple components that have come into the equation, such as crowd, excited delirium, George Floyd being on drugs, and resisting arrest. We need to navigate through all of that to make a sound assessment, but that sound assessment will be predicated on the testimony from Derek Chauvin on the back end of this trial. And that's something that I'm waiting to see. I'm anxious to see, because the whole country, we have 337 million people that reside in the United States, and we're all at the edge of our seats looking for a verdict. And everyone wants, I shouldn't say everyone, but a gross majority of the African American or the communities of color have the expectation of a guilty verdict. But bear in mind, it's very difficult to convict a police officer when they're acting in their official capacity in uniform in the process of taking someone into custody. Historically, these have been Herculean feats. We're hoping that things change in this particular case, and it's a wait and see approach.
All right. With that said, thank you so much, Dr. Porter, for being with us and giving us your experiences. We'll still be watching you on HLN. So thank you for all your work that you're doing within this case.
And Michael, thank you for all you're doing for the viewership and getting out the appropriate message to the masses so they maintain a level of being informed, because the social constructs in society should be very specific to getting the right information, not information that's that's inaccurate. And you are the voice of the people, and you're advancing the necessary agenda to doing not what people want, but what's right. And I commend you and I salute you for your endeavors. And thank you for having me as a participant on your podcast. And I know that this is something that's going to come into overwhelming success based on you being at the focal point and driving the machine.
Thank you so much.
So much for watching. I hope that you learned something and continue to watch the coverage as it is unfolding throughout our eyes. We continue to keep his family, George Floyd, in our prayers. Thank you for watching.